The International Monetary Fund, in its latest release fiscal monitor report for the month of October 2021, has projected that Nigeria's gross debt to gross domestic product ratio will rise to 42% by 2026 from 35.7% in 2021. The agency also forecast that the country's gross debt to GDP ratio will increase from 35.7% in 2021 to 36.9% in 2022, 37.7% in 2023, 39.1% in 2024, and 40.6% in 2025. According to the report, general government revenue to GDP ratio will decrease from 7.2% in 2021 to 6.5% in 2026, while the general government expenditure to GDP ratio will decrease from 13.3% in 2021 to 12.6% in 2026. It will interest you to know that Nigeria's debt service ratio fell from 23% in 1990 to an all-time low of 7% in 2019, lower than some more major African countries such as Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, and Tanzania. Based on the debt to GDP and debt service ratio, the big question begging for answer now is Nigeria's debt sustainable? Well, that's a big question, and we'll get answers to that. But before we go into that, Nigerians in general and the nation's security agencies in particular will not forget in a hurry the violent twist that characterized the EndSars protest last October, in which our policemen were killed across the country and scores injured, and several others are left lives in threatening conditions by rampaging hoodlums that hijacked the peaceful protest, which cost the country's economy massive losses and the business community to lose about 700 billion naira. While the economic impact of the violent protest on the business community still persists 1 year later, it is pertinent for government at all levels to come up with programs and initiatives that will address youth unemployment and, of course, reduce social vices in the country. Well, joining me to look at this two-in-one topic is an investment analyst at United Capital Plc, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye. Good afternoon, Mr. Akinloye. It's good to see you today.
Good afternoon, Tolu. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you for having me again.
Yes, well, I would really like to put figures into play at the moment, talking about estimated loss and all of that. But let's do an overall estimate of what it means when we have protests like this one. People cannot move freely as like they would, but now it's getting better with the pictures we are getting now, and even feelers we're getting from Lekki. But what would you say has been the effect of this generally on our economy? This is an economy that is struggling to stabilize. We know what's been happening with our GDP figures and even inflation. How do you see all of this affecting growth?
Okay, yes, clearly, whenever there are protests, whenever there's any form of social unrest, you definitely expect that to, create a bit of bottleneck for economic activities in, locations where these social unrests are happening. And I think we definitely think that the situation at Lekki definitely, alludes to that fact, because basically we know that in terms of economic activities, many times goods have to move from the markets, from the places where they are produced to the markets where they will be sold, definitely. And when there are unrest and issues like this, then that's basically creates a lot of challenge for the supply chain, and that also creates pressure in terms of economic activities. And most likely all the businesses within that location would probably either be unable to open and operate, and it means revenue for that particular day in the year is gone. And depending on how long the protests last for, then it could really run into huge sums of revenue for them. And we look at the fact that first it's important to point out that the reason why we have these issues, like you mentioned earlier, in terms of a lot of work still needs to be done in terms of correcting social vices and other issues that may be plaguing, overall welfare of citizens, particularly the young population generally. Like you alluded to, a lot still needs to be done, because when social unrest is basically a product of of institutional breakdown. It's basically, a product of when institutions are not, properly functioning well, where people feel that everything is running properly, and then there is no need to complain, because protests are basically a way for citizens to let, in a democratic environment, for the government in power to know that, okay, they are not pleased with the situation of things, and they think so, so should be done. So clearly, in terms of improving and not allowing to keep on, because like mentioned, estimates of about between 70 revenue, assets, value of properties were lost. Insurance firms came out to say they paid almost about 5.5 billion in compensation, in claims, as a result of the protests. And all this just points out the fact that social unrest protests are very costly for any economy. And when you even look at an economy like ours, that is already, struggling and, almost on its knees, we can't afford to have persistent social unrest like this. So clearly there's a lot that needs to be done in order to ensure that these things causing these agitations, for example, reforming the police system, also in terms of improving youth employment, job creation, and ensuring that everyone can basically see that the system is working for everyone and not for maybe a few set of people, or you have to, work. You have to do everything possible to just find your way within the system. If there's a system working for everyone and institutions are running properly, then you won't have this kind of social unrest, these protests, and people, trying to air their grievances to the government. And when we don't have that, definitely SMEs will be able to function properly. People will be able to go to work. Economic activities will be able to run properly. So yes, this costs a lot, and we believe the government definitely has a lot of work to do in terms of ensuring that this kind of issues don't reoccur time and time again, because it basically points to the fact that there's a significant level of institutional breakdown there.
When I think about issues like this, I look at efforts being made both on the fiscal now and the monetary side. I'm not staying with just the monetary side, that we've seen a lot of inflow when it has to be talking about MSME development, talking about trying to COVID-19 palliatives and all of that we've seen over time. And we also see the fiscal side also coming sometimes too with some sort of support. But the question is, before we move out of this, the question is, does it really trickle down to those that really need these funds, or those that really need all of these opportunities? That is where the challenge is. We hear of these funds being doled out, but people come out to say, how many of us really get it? So what would you say is the effect of all of these initiatives coming from both sides, the fiscal, the monetary side, focusing on youths? How well would you say it's getting along?
Okay, so definitely, we've for the monetary side, for example, like you mentioned, we've had lots of announcements of intervention within the SMEs, the micro and small medium scale enterprises. We've seen lots of initiatives to sort of at least reduce pressure on businesses and SMEs within the country, of which we know many of these businesses are also run by the young populace and the younger part of the Nigerian population. But again, like you mentioned, from the fiscal side, a lot still needs to be done, and we speak to the fact that yes, even though the CBN, via the monetary side, they've done a lot in terms of making these credit facilities, special interventions available. Like you mentioned, the question is there a system in place? Is there a mechanism in place to ensure that these funds and these interventions are equally distributed, such that everyone who is entitled or who is eligible to, who qualifies to access these funds, get access to these funds? So all those things are things that must be put in place. So, for example, what do we have? The database of the population of the country? Do we have the database of everyone, within the borders of Nigeria, where we can easily identify, okay, these people within this age group, this is the kind of business they are doing, and they qualify for this funding, and we are able to give this necessary funding for them to be able to run legal economic activities, which would also help them generate more employment and even employ more people. So it's a question of, is the right mechanism in place to ensure that these interventions and resources are equitably distributed across. So that is a key concern. So it basically still speaks to the need that there is a need for an overhauling of the institutions and the mechanism around economic activities, around enforcement of law and order, around ensuring that everyone within the civil service, within the private sector, they are all able to work, and the institutions are able to bring people to justice and ensure that everything is fine without recourse to higher powers, or being, without having to worry about the repercussions of them taking the right stand. And it all boils down to the institutions in place, from taking it away even from the interventions down to even looking at activities within the police force, within the military, within the finance ministry, for example, within the CBN, within the schemes set up to sort of intervene in small scale and small and medium enterprises. All these institutions, all these mechanisms across the different spheres need to be strengthened for them to be able to properly exercise their functions and ensure that all the activities are properly conducted. And that is where we need to get it right. So when it comes to distribution of interventions, when it comes to distribution of loans, when it comes to grants for businesses, for youth, a lot needs to be done to ensure that the right mechanism is in place for these funds, for these grants, for these interventions to get to the right people who need them. So it is about the mechanism in place. It is about the institutions in place, empowered and strengthened for them to be able to do these things without recourse to any authority, or, without recourse to anybody. Basically, the institution must be stronger than the people within those institutions.
Stuff there, Ayo. Let's now look at the forecast from IMF now versus government stance that Nigeria does not have a debt crisis at hand, or rather a revenue generation challenge, as well as the measure of economic debt through the lens of debt to GDP ratio.
Okay, yeah. So basically, looking at the Nigerian debt situation in terms of our fiscal sustainability, where we are and where we think we should be, you look at it from two lenses, and then you say, okay, first on the debt service to revenue side, and on the debt to GDP side, which the IMF is looking at. On the debt to GDP side, we are not. If we look at the generally accepted measures of sustainability, we can be considered fiscally sustainable. But you look at our debt service to revenue ratio, and then you know that there are significant issues plaguing our fiscal framework and our fiscal sustainability framework. So, for example, just to give a perspective, last year our debt service to GDP alone was about 90%, and this year so far we've already done another roughly about 91% in terms of debt service to revenue ratio, and that definitely points to the fact that it's unsustainable for the government to continue to borrow at current levels without expanding the pie. That's referring to the government's revenue base. So, and as long as the revenue problem remains, there will always be a recourse to lending from the capital markets in order to shore up the revenue deficiencies. So just to give a bit of picture around that. So this year, from January to August, based on the most recent available data from the Budget Office and from the Ministry of Finance, we look at the fact that revenue performance for 2021 is about 67.8%, so roughly about 68%. So that means the federal government has only been able to achieve 68% of its budgeted revenue. Whereas on the expenditure side, it has done about 94% of its projected expenditure for 2021 budget alone. So it means if we're already running a budget deficit where our revenue, our expenditure is always going to be greater than revenue, and we are now in a situation whereby even the revenue projections we are unable to meet, and our expenditure we are expending almost 100% of the budgeted expenditure. This means that we have to now borrow even more than the deficits that we already plan to finance, and that creates sustained pressure for the fiscal sustainability framework. And when you now drill that home, even to looking at historical numbers, over the past, say, 5 years, our average revenue performance has been roughly around 74%. If you look at average revenue performance over the past 5 years, as long as these revenue concerns remain, which, in a way, it can be right to say we have a revenue problem rather than a debt problem. But the main thing is, if you're unable to grow the pie, if you're unable to grow the revenue, then it might be best to cut your coat according to your size until you are able to grow your revenue. If you're able to grow our revenues, then we can now begin to ramp up expenditure and then give more room for debt to take on more leverage to be able to push through some of our expenditure. Debt is not necessarily a bad thing to finance an economy, or to bring an economy to continue to make an economy continue to grow. In fact, a deficit budget is one of the major expansionary fiscal tools that you can use to climb out of a recession, which is necessary at the point or at the stage where we are at now. But ensuring that it is sustainable in the long run is something that is very important. And for our debt levels to be sustainable, we need to ensure that our revenue numbers improve significantly from where we are right now. So that is really that is the main bone of contention. If revenue doesn't improve, then it is difficult to continue to justify borrowing at the current levels we are borrowing.
Before I let you go, I'd like us to wrap up on this note. We're seeing an increasing pressure on the naira, of course, due to governments borrowing and increasing spending on recurrent expenditure. We have over the years adopted the same old model. What rooms for change do you see the government taking up as we deliberate and look into the 2022 spending plan?
Okay, yes. So in terms of the impact of borrowing on consumption, and in terms of impact also on exchange rates, definitely creative ways are there for government to explore to ensure that they're still able to borrow at a sustainable level to drive budget and also improve consumption. Clearly, one of the ways that there are several mechanisms that this can be constructed. For example, one of the ways that we think is very interesting for government to explore is, for example, issuing zero coupon bonds. Bonds where the government, zero coupon bonds are basically bonds where you issue them at a discount, similar to what you have in the treasury bills market, but this time around they will be over longer tenors. And we're able to issue these instruments such that we don't have to pay interest on these instruments. And what it means is you don't have to service these debts on yearly basis, and that reduces the pressure that you have on your revenue. And you are still able to get the funds you need for you to be able to run the government, but ensuring that will take me to the second point, ensuring that these debt proceeds are used on projects that are expected to one, improve revenue or make the business environment conducive, such that when the business environment becomes more conducive, businesses are able to thrive, they become more profitable, and then they're able to pay more taxes to the federal government, which ultimately even becomes, a means of driving revenue up again. So first, trying to structure our debt program in such a way that it reduces the rate at which we have to service our debt obligations every year, would be very, very crucial. So, exploring an instrument like a zero coupon bond is something that is going to be quite interesting, and it will be interesting to see how that would work, if it's an alternative that federal government can push to investors, and they would embrace in the capital markets. But it will be a different way of doing our borrowing, such that we can still borrow, and at the same time won't place too much pressure on an already pressured revenue base. Number two, proceeds from the debt issuances, should be directed at projects that would make an impact either on the business environment or directly on federal government's revenue. The overall objective is to ensure that when you're borrowing for investment purposes, and those investments that you're making will be able to generate future cash flows for you to strengthen your revenue base in the long run. It is difficult to say that has been the story in Nigeria for the past 5 years, because the growth in government revenue has been basically inconsistent all through the years. So we need to ensure that all our borrowings are directed at projects. We make borrowings that are tied at projects, maybe to improve tools that we use in agriculture, improve road infrastructure, and basically things like this, maybe to revamp our ports, the Apapa ports, to ensure that business activities can be conducted more seamlessly, and businesses are able to make more profits, which means more tax revenue for the government. And lastly, I would say the federal government definitely needs to be realistic with its spending expenditure, particularly when you look at the 2022 budget. Again, you can say that they are being overly ambitious with their expectations regarding spending and with regards to revenue generation. So we think there's a need for the federal government to cut its coat to size, basically spend within the framework of what it can afford, rather than unnecessarily extending pressure on its revenue and fiscal sustainability levels.
I must thank you so very much, Mr. Ayorinde Akinloye, the Investment Analyst, United Capital Plc. Thank you very much for spending your time with us, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having me, Tolu. It was a pleasure.